Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci. Today, we're going to explore what I think is really one of the most important aspects of investigating the JFK assassination, and that is the testimony of the doctors that worked on President Kennedy when he was in Parkland Hospital, and then also when he was flown to Bethesda for the autopsy. It's very, very important because the Warren Commission did everything they could to misrepresent and complicate and obfuscate a lot of the actual words, the testimony of the doctors, because it was a primary source of everyone knowing the truth. And that was that JFK unfortunately had most of the back of his head blown away. That is the occipital and parietal areas in the back of the head. And you'll see that just every doctor, really, and nurse who attended to President Kennedy on that fateful day on November 22nd, 1963, will explain to the Warren Commission in great detail what they saw and how they treated those horrific wounds in the back of JFK's head. So the Warren Commission had a huge problem because you don't have to be any kind of an expert to realize that if the back of someone's head is blown out, then the shot has to have come from the front in order to have that kind of velocity with a small entrance wound in the front and then the large cavity that would be produced from the expanding bullet and damage that it would have done by the time it exited the president's head in the back. So, with every doctor and every nurse, both at Parkland Hospital and Bethesda, knowing that the parietal occipital wound in the back of JFK's head was massive, a gaping wound, what did the Warren Commission do? Well, they published this photo. As you can see, it's an outright and a blatant lie, an obvious attempt to not just misrepresent JFK's wound, but to completely deceive the American people into believing that there was no frontal shot and no conspiracy in the murder of President Kennedy. Now, this is where we get really to the crux of the problem, in my opinion. And I'm not talking about just the JFK assassination. What I'm talking about here, people, is treason. Okay? Most of the Warren Commission members who had seen the autopsy photos and people like Arlen Specter, who was in charge of the medical evidence. They didn't just make a decision to lie to the American people about President Kennedy's wounds. They made a decision to commit treason, in my opinion, because they knew the truth. They had proof of the truth. But what did they do? They worried about their own power and greed and what was going to happen to their careers, and they lied. They outright lied to us, and they maintained that lie for 60 some years until we reached the point that we are today. Now, one of the things that you initially will think of and ask right away was, well, how could they possibly do this when the autopsy photos would reveal the truth? Well, what the Warren Commission did, if you can believe this, is that they did not allow the autopsy photos to be used. And they came up with three or four exceedingly weak excuses why this would be the case. Instead, what did they do? They had medical illustrators come in and they didn't allow the medical illustrators to even look at the actual autopsy photos, if you can believe that. Just going off what was told to them, they were expected to produce medical illustrations which were used by the Warren Commission in place of autopsy photos, which of course would have revealed the truth. We'll get to more of that in a moment. But for now, let's dive right in and look at what the testimony of the doctors and nurses actually was. Dr. Charles Carrico. Our inspector asked, "Will you describe as specifically as you can the head wound, which you have already mentioned briefly?" And Dr. Carrico says, "Sure, this was a 5 by 7 centimeter defect in the posterior skull, the occipital region. There was an absence of the calvium or skull in this area with shredded tissue, brain tissue present, and initially considerable slow oozing. Then, after we established some circulation, there was more profuse bleeding from this wound." Spector says, "Would you describe as precisely as possible the nature of the head wound which you have observed?" And Dr. Carrico says, "The wound that I saw was a large gaping wound located in the right occipital parietal area. I would estimate it to be about 5 to 7 centimeters in size, more or less circular, with avulsions of the calvarium and scalp tissue. As I stated before, there was shredded material, cerebral and cerebellar tissues in the wounds and fragments of the skull to the dura." It's also important to understand that Dr. Carrico is, like all the doctors questioned, will see the throat wound as a small wound of entrance. And Spector says, "Would you continue to describe your observations of the president?" Carrico says his color was ashen, bluish gray, cyanotic, making no spontaneous movements. "We opened his shirt and tie and observed a small wound in the anterior lower third of the neck. Listen very briefly." And then he goes on to say a little bit more about the head wound. So there you are, Dr. Charles Carrico, who talks about the large gaping wound, 5 to 7 centimeters, really large in the back of President Kennedy's head, plus a wound of entry, a very small wound of entry in the throat. We'll see both of these with every doctor and nurse. Dr. Malcolm Perry. Our inspector says, "Will you now describe as specifically as you can the injury which you noted to the president's head?" Dr. Perry says, "As I mentioned previously in the record, I made only a cursory examination. I noticed a large avulsive wound of the right parietal occipital area in which both the scalp and portions of the skull were absent." And one of the most important observations that Dr. Perry makes there is that portions of the scalp and the skull were absent. And again, how could you pull the scalp up like would have been evident in that picture that was provided by the Warren Commission with just a very small hole there? Dr. Perry is saying here, not only was there a large gaping wound, but the skull and the scalp were both absent, so you could never pull those up. So that's a really, really important observation. Dr. Kemp Clark. And here Spector is asking him about the wound in the front of the throat. And Inspector is trying to say, well, wouldn't we have noticed it coming out the back of his neck? And Dr. Clark says, "No, sir, such a wound could have easily been overlooked in the presence of the much larger wound in the right occipital region of the president's skull, from which considerable blood loss had occurred, which stained the back of his head, neck, and upper shoulders." So what Dr. Kemp is saying here is that if there was a throat wound, if it had actually gone out the back of President Kennedy's neck, it wouldn't have necessarily been noticed when they were working on him, because there was so much loss of skull and brain tissue from the large wound in the occipital parietal region that it stained the whole back of President Kennedy's neck. So even an exit wound from the throat, from the entry of the throat wound and exit wound in the back, may not have been noticed. Dr. Robert McClelland. Inspector asks, "Will you more fully describe your observation with respect to the head wound?" McClelland says, "As I took the position at the head of the table To help with the tracheostomy, I was in a position that I could very closely examine the head wound. I noticed in the right posterior portion of the skull had been blasted. It had been shattered, apparently by the force of the shot, so that the parietal bone was protruded up through the scalp and seemed to be fractured almost along its right posterior half, as well as some of the occipital bone being fractured in its lateral half and sprung open, the bones I mentioned, in such a way that you could actually look down into the skull cavity itself and see that probably a third or so, at least, of brain tissue, posterior cerebral tissue, and some of the cerebellar tissue had been blasted out. There was a large amount of bleeding, which was occurring mainly from the large venous channels in the skull, which had been blasted open. All right, this is exceedingly important because what Dr. McClelland is saying is that he was stationed right over the head wound. Not only was there a large gaping wound, but it was just horrendous in the sense that at least a third of the brain had already been expelled and more was leaking out. Not only that, it was all missing with bones protruding, the ones that were there. So there's no way, again, that that fake picture put out by the Warren Commission of that perfectly contoured back of JFK's head with the small entrance wound could even possibly be true. All right, Dr. Paul Peters, Spector asked, did you notice any holes below the occipital? Say in this area below here. And Dr. Peters says, no, I did not. And at the time and the moments immediately following the injury, we speculated as to whether he had been shot once or twice because we saw the wound of entry in the throat and noted the large occipital wound, and it is a known fact that high velocity missiles often have a small wound of entrance and a large wound of exit. And I'm just giving you my honest impressions at the time. So once again, Dr. Paul Peters is saying, hey, that throat wound was definitely a wound of entrance. And anybody that says differently doesn't know what they're talking about. That's really what he's saying. And he's saying that in the occipital region in the back of President Kennedy's head, the way it was blown out, of course, that was a wound of exit. Nurse Diana Bowman, Spector asks, in a general way, what did you observe with respect to President Kennedy's condition? Miss Boron says he was very pale, lying across Mrs. Kennedy's knee. There seemed to be blood everywhere. When I ran around to the other side of the car, I saw the condition of the head. You saw the condition of his what? She says, the back of his head, the back of his head. And Spector says, what was that condition? And she says, well, it was very bad, you know. And Spector says, how many holes did you see? Mrs. Boron says, just saw one large hole. Secret Service Special Agent Clint Hill. Spector says, what did you observe as to President Kennedy's condition on arrival at the hospital? And Mr. Hill says, the right rear portion of his head was missing. It was lying in the rear of the seat. His brain was exposed. There was blood and bits of brain all over the entire rear portion of the car. Mrs. Kennedy was completely covered with blood. There was so much blood you could not tell if there had been any other wound or not, except for the one large gaping wound in the right rear portion of the head. So Nurse Diane Boron and Secret Service Special Agent Clint Hill both saw the same thing. The back of President Kennedy's skull basically completely gone, missing, not there. They both were just amazed at the amount of damage that was obvious with the rear of JFK's head. Secret Service Special Agent Roy Kellerman. Spector says, I'd like to develop your understanding and your observations of the four wounds on President Kennedy. Kellerman says, okay, this all transpired in the morgue of the Naval Hospital in Bethesda. He had a large wound this size. Spector says, indicating a circle with your finger, the diameter of 5 inches. Would that be approximately correct? Kellerman says, yes, circular, yes. On this part of the hill, Spector says, indicating the rear portion of the head. Kellerman, yes. Spector says, more to the right side of the head. Kellerman says, right, that was removed. Spector says, when you say this was removed, what do you mean by that? And Kellerman says, the skull part was removed. And again, here, Kellerman's saying, it's gone. It's gone. There was nothing to pull over. You can't pull a flap over when the flap's not there. Kellerman is saying exactly what everyone else said. The back of President Kennedy's head was blown away. The pictures that were released, the illustrations that were released by the Warren Commission were complete fabrications, complete lies to the American public. And the people that would put out that photo of the back of JFK's head in pretty much pristine condition, except for a small wound of entry, rather than the truth that we now know that all of the doctors and all of the eyewitnesses and all of the people that saw the Zapruder film that have common sense, we know the back of President Kennedy's head was pretty much blown away. They murdered our president. They changed democracy to suit them on November 22nd, 1963. And the conspirators would have never gotten away with it. And the conspirators on the Warren Commission would have never gotten away with it if it hadn't been for people like the assistant counsels and people like Arlen Specter in charge of the medical evidence. They put their careers, they put their greed and power ahead of their duty to our country. And that to me is unforgivable. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being with me on the channel. And if you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you. We'll see you next time.